everyone. Today's lecture is going to cover Rosie the Riveter, gender, race, and the tensions of social change in World War II. You might notice this shirt that I'm wearing today. I picked it up at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum in Hawaii a couple years ago. I was there with my family. It was a very powerful visit that reminded me how history, it doesn't just live in books, it lives in places that we preserve, in the artifacts that we display, and even in the clothing that we wear to remember. Um, so, just as visiting Pearl Harbor made me think about the cost of war, studying Rosie the Riveter makes us think about the complexities of social change, especially through the lens of women's history, and what opportunities were open and then what barriers remained. But before we dive in, I'd like to start off by asking you a question, something for you to keep in the back of your mind as we're going through this lecture. And then you continue on with your readings and then your discussion assignment. If you were a woman in 1943, what opportunities and challenges might you face if you wanted to work outside of the home? This is something that you're going to have to take yourself out of today's context and put yourself into the past and think about the things that you have today that you wouldn't have had back then. So keep this in your mind. By the end of this lecture, we'll revisit this question and see how your answer might change once we layer in the different complexities of race, class, and regional differences. So here is our roadmap for the class today. We're going to look at historical context, the controversial problem, the issue of inclusive engagement, larger connections, and then we'll have a couple more reflection questions at the end. So as far as historical context, when the U.S. entered World War II, there were factories that were facing labor shortages. Millions of men were drafted, so they started looking towards women to begin filling those roles. Between 1940 and 1945, 6 million women entered the workforce. Many of these were in defense industries. A lot of these women were working for the very first time, but they needed to do their duty and start filling these positions and keeping the home front going. So government campaigns encouraged this shift. The We Can Do It poster and the song Rosie the Riveter became symbols of this patriotic service. Um, as you'll read, Maureen Honey points out in her study of wartime media, these posters and ads often presented working women as glamorous, cheerful, and temporary contributors to the war effort. I think that's a big thing to think about. An image that downplayed the realities of fatigue, childcare struggles, and discrimination. So, real quick pause for reflection. What do you think propaganda like this was designed to accomplish? Was it mainly about empowering women or about convincing them to set aside traditional expectations for the sake of national survival? And these are questions that'll be raised in your readings this week. So, the controversial problem that we're going to discuss is the core tension in the story of Rosie the Riveter. On one hand, there's this empowerment. She's a very powerful symbol. She's strong. Women proved that, showing that women could go do skilled work that they had considered to be men's jobs. They began earning wages, gaining new independence, and they disrupted old stereotypes about women, about what they could do and what they could not do. Some historians even argue that this moment was a turning point for women in the workplace, but that's something we'll discuss. But when we have the limits, but when women have limits, even as they worked in the factories, women were almost always paid less than men for the same job, which is something that has continued. Many face hostility from male workers. They're not welcome. And when the war ended in 1945, women were often laid off or pressured to give up their jobs so the returning veterans could take their places. And then there's the question of exclusion. The Rosie the Riveter posters mostly celebrated white middle-class women, but for African American women or Mexican American women, these stories looked very different. Many had to fight just to get into the war industries, and when they did, they were usually pushed into the lowest paying jobs or the most dangerous positions. So here's another question to put yourself into the mindset when you're reading more. If you were a black woman or a Mexican American woman in 1943, how different might your experience be from the smiling Rosie the Riveter we see in the propaganda posters? So we'll really quickly touch on inclusive engagement. This is why we study history from multiple perspectives. The Rosie image is powerful, but it's incomplete. It masks the unequal distribution of opportunity across race and class. So there were a lot of stories left out that many historians now are trying to uncover. So, when we put this into a larger perspective, after the war, many women were pushed back into their traditional roles, but the memory of what they had accomplished remained. There were, it's hard to get a sense of freedom and then have it taken away from you. This helped fuel later debates on workplace equality, the rise of second wave feminism, and today's ongoing struggles with wage gaps and work life balance. One of our authors will be reading, Claudia Golden, traces this back to what she calls the revolving door of women's employment. There were periods of entry followed by extreme setbacks. So this illustrates that progress for women was rarely linear. It was a lot of back and forth. So do you think World War II created a lasting change for women, or was it more of a temporary disruption? So we'll look at different evidence that might lean one way or the other. So Rosie the Riveter represents both opportunity and limitation, empowerment and exclusion. This complexity reminds us that history is not a neat story of progress, it's a dialogue of competing realities. So going back to the question I asked you in the beginning, if you were a woman in 1943, what opportunities and challenges might you face if you wanted to work outside the home? Now that you've heard about unequal pay, post war layoffs, and racial disparities, how might you answer how would you feel about this? What nuances would you add? So, for your discussion board, I'd like you to post your reflections and reply to at least one classmate comparing perspectives. Where do you see common ground? Where do you notice different assumptions? Is there other resources that you know about that you can share that might support your peers' arguments, or maybe bring in a new perspective for them? So, just from my perspective, if I imagine myself as a woman, I am a woman, but in 1943, I would live a much different life. I would think about the pride I would feel stepping into a factory or a shipyard for the first time. Like many women described in Susan Hartman's The Home Front and Beyond, I would be doing something my mother or grandmother never imagined possible, which is earning a paycheck, learning how to use different tools, and contributing directly to the war effort. But I would also think about the pain of what came after, being told that almost immediately overnight that the skills that I had learned or the money that I had earned from learning these skills were no longer needed, and I would have to find a new way um, to to earn to to earn some more money from this financial independence that I so rarely knew. So a man could come back and reclaim his job. Claudia Golden's economic research shows just how quickly women's employment dropped after 1945, with many factories laying off female workers in mass to make room for returning veterans. So I would probably feel betrayed and frustrated with my country and my government that this propaganda was sold to me that this is something we can do, just to turn around to be told, go home, your job is done, you've done enough. So back to Maureen Honey, she points out that wartime magazines reinforce this by shifting their tone after 1945, urging women to embrace domesticity and motherhood again. So as a woman, I would feel this just injustice, and it'd be very frustrating. Um, and I can only imagine it would be as a minority woman, Black woman, or African American, or Mexican American woman. I know that feeling would be magnified. Doris Weatherford describes how women of color often had to fight twice as hard to get into war jobs just be let go as well. I've shared my perspective, and I look forward to hearing yours and your discussions. Good luck, everybody, and I'm here if you need any help.